Bianna, Yonit, it is so great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks so much.
Great to see you, Moshe.
We are in multiple time zones on multiple sides of Earth. Yonit, thank you for joining us from just after 11 p.m. Tel Aviv time.
I will try and put together verbs and adjectives. I'm not sure I can, so I'll just try. It's a little bit late, but I'll make that attempt.
If you have to fall into native Hebrew, we can translate. we have those resources here.
She's multilingual, polyglot over here.
Oh, between the two of you, you got most of the UN covered.
It's true.
Yeah.
The better UN.
That's our next role for both of us.
I won't go through your full bios here, but Bianna, I'm lucky to call a friend and a former colleague at CBS. She's now a CNN anchor and senior global affairs analyst. Yonit is an anchor for Israel's Channel 12, as well as the co-host. Some of you might be familiar with her voice as the co-host of the podcast Unholy. Yonit, lots of fans, by the way, here at Mo News of Unholy.
That's heartwarming. Thank you so much.
Once people are done listening to our podcast, I recommend head over to listen to Unholy. And Bianna, where are you in the podcasting space these days?
I listen to you. I listen to Yonit. I've become a big podcast fan. I mean, I've always listened to podcasts when I run. It's a great pastime, and I love it. It's where I get a lot of my, not necessarily news, because, we still have other avenues to get our information. But in terms of digesting, it's far, far better than X and Twitter used to be.
Yeah, no, there you get headlines, but if you're looking for insight and real conversation, the podcasting space, I think, is the best space right now. You two have written a new book. It is out November 11th, and it focuses on antisemitism. And I have a lot of questions there, but first I want to start state of play right now with a simple question, or maybe not so simple question for each of you. We are now just over 2 years since October 7th, 2023. The aftermath changed the reality for obviously Jews in Israel, but Jews around the world. As you reflect on the past couple of years, I want to begin with you, Yonit. As an Israeli, how has your world changed, both personally, but also as an Israeli, looking at the state of play now, just 2 years after those attacks?
I mean, you say 2 years, and to be honest, I think it's been an extremely long day in the sense that we are very much trapped on that day. I think only when the hostages, the last living hostages came back, it was this sort of collective sigh of relief from this country that has been really traumatized by what happened. It really is a feeling like your whole world has been turned upside down. And I remember the feeling the first couple of days where, again, I'm the anchor of the evening news, so it doesn't allow for, sitting under your duvet and crying for 3 weeks, which is what I think everyone felt like they wanted to. But I remember distinctly having this feeling like there are 3 different emotions possible on the shelf ever since. And that is fear and anxiety, that is sadness, and it is rage. And the thing I kind of actively did was to take sadness, and because the rest is just really blurring your thinking. So I think this short answer to your question, because I can go on, but I think just being very, very, very sad and wondering a lot about the state of the world, about what we thought was right about our country, which is the IDF will always save us, and what we thought was right about the rest of the world, which is sometimes there are people who hate us, and that gets to some extremes, but that, is supposed to be part of history. And suddenly it erupted in a way that for us was like a second heartbreak after October 7th.
Yeah, I want to get to more of that in a second, but first, Bianna, as you reflect on these past 2 years, how were you different? How was your life different? How was your perspective different on October 6th, 2023, and how is it today?
Wow, so different. It's interesting. We started talking about podcasts at the top of this conversation. And if I go back to where I was on October 7th, 2023, I was at my son's soccer tournament in Albany over the weekend, and woke up to these horrific headlines. And as it became more and more apparent how dire the situation was and how serious this attack was, I realized that I didn't want to reflect that in terms of my disposition and my emotions in front of my son and all of his teammates as we're on the soccer pitch. And so I remember thinking, I need to talk to Yonit. She needs to put out an emergency podcast ASAP. And she did the next day. And I don't know, Yonit, if you remember this, or if you even would, say this again now, knowing what we did and what we've come to find out. But she said, this is not an existential threat to Israel, this attack. But, then she went into the horrors of what we were learning hours later. And it was very reassuring at the time. And then, of course, we saw what unfolded. I think Yonit even recently said to me some of the information that she's learning from these hostages that have been released. Like we still don't know the full story of just how bad that day was and what an emotional scar it left, not only for Israelis, obviously first and foremost, but for Jews around the world. And I never viewed myself as a naive person, but I'm a completely changed person as a Jewish mother, journalist, immigrant to this country, which I love so much and I'm so grateful. My parents brought me here, but there were 2 times where I was nervous about being here in America and feared for my safety. One was on September 11th, being in New York, just 2 blocks away from the Twin Towers. And, as a Jew, you start to wonder, are we really safe here as well? Following some of the displays of anti-Semitism that we've witnessed around the world, some of the gaslighting, I would say, I don't know how else to interpret, the reactions that we've seen. It's been quite lonely at times when you're trying to explain to friends and colleagues about how it feels, how you're trying to talk to your children. In 2023, 2024, we're progressive citizens of the world. And, we've embraced other social justice movements to try to eradicate and stamp out other forms of hate. And here there's anti-Semitism, and you're being told that's not what it is. It's anti-Zionism, which was a whole other category I never thought would be a controversial word. Zionism is just the belief that Israel has the right to exist. And here all of a sudden that becomes a talker. So, I've learned a lot. I never envisioned that I'd write a book about anti-Semitism or for children. And I have to say, Mo, it has been uplifting to see how my children, especially my now 13-year-old son, has really embraced his Judaism, his heritage, traditions following October 7th.
Yeah, I should mention, so Bianna, you are the mother of a 13-year-old and a 9-year-old. Yonit, you have we have corrected their ages, a 12-year-old, a 10-year-old, and a 7.5-year-old.
We'll edit that out.
All claim to be mine. They all claim to be mine. This is true.
And you let me know if during this podcast, they all end up going to sleep close to midnight in Tel Aviv right now. Back to the, you sort of mentioned it, Yonit, the place that Israelis feel in the world, their place in the region, their security. I remember the warning early on. It was one of the first visits. I think it was right after the 7th. There was Biden, and then one of the visits Lloyd Austin, who was defense secretary, made. And this quote struck me. I mean, I still remember it. And, it's similar to what we heard from other American officials. But I think he said explicitly, like, the Israeli government could achieve a military victory in Gaza, but you might suffer a strategic defeat. And, that was part of the various warnings they were giving the Israeli government. And, like, when you look at it, Israel can now fly over, most of the Middle East between Tel Aviv and Tehran. Never really been militarily stronger, but diplomatically isolated. And so curious, how do Israelis right now feel about that? Reflect on the last 2 years and the war on Gaza and both what it achieved and the effect that it had, and how they view their place in the world right now.
Well, first of all, how long do we have through this conversation? Because I can answer that at length. I mean, I think, first of all, it took us a while. And again, the shock of what happened on October 7th, I just thought we just, marked the 2 years. And I was thinking that on the first night of that Saturday, we were still talking about estimation of 150 Israelis who were killed. That was on the first day. We did not even grasp the magnitude of what had happened on that first day, or not even on that first week. And it took us, I think, a while to realize that the world has turned very quickly from seeing us as victims, which I think it did for about a few days, into something completely different, even the opposite. And Look, Israelis, I think, were very, very much, and I think it's understandable because I have, as you know, a conversation with the outside world every week on the podcast, and it always feels like you don't focus on how the outside world is looking at you. The truth is that we were very focused on what happened to us and how to move forward and what to do. And again, there were also wars on other fronts at the same time. I think Israelis think that it is unfair, the way that they are portrayed, the way Israel is being criticized. I think they're now beginning to realize the sort of the way that it looks, and we are dealing with it, but we're dealing with it in a different way, because until this moment, we kind of felt, all of us were walking around with a very heavy heart. The fact that you have the feeling of your brothers and sisters are in tunnels tormented by Hamas for 2 years, and suddenly you can at least in that regard say, okay, we're taking a breath now. There are less and less soldiers in Gaza. The war is winding down. I think it gives the Israelis this sort of perspective of looking at the world. I don't think that everyone, when looking at the war, thinks that everything was done perfectly, but I think that we generally, to the extent that I can represent the Israeli mainstream, we think that this is a very, very difficult war in very, very difficult conditions, but large parts of the world see it in an unfair way.
Right. I mean, in terms of accusations of genocide and ethnic cleansing and the like, and not just coming from the usual suspects, right, but coming from leaders of Western countries that have been longtime allies of Israel.
Yes, and I think that the word genocide, of course, is not a coincidence. There is a conscious attempt to make Israel look like it is Nazi Germany. You see that in all of the terminology, it is a difficult and heartbreaking thing. I should add, right, being the Israeli journalist, that the one thing that we do a lot would be to criticize the Israeli government. So I should add that some of these statements, being said by Israeli ministers are not helping Israel's case in the outside world. And of course, it is tainted by a lot of Israel hate and sometimes of anti-Semitism as well. Right.
I mean, a lot of the focus on the accusations of genocide is on intent, right? And when you had various statements by Israeli, not former, but current also far right ministers, it sort of reinforces that the intent element of it.
It really does. And I think that's part of the problem. I mean, if we don't, you can't just sit and say, okay, everything is anti-Semitism, that's how we're going to treat it. No, you need to have a serious way of dealing with it. And I hope Israel I know that Israel, at least in certain areas, is trying to deal with it as best as possible, I hope.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the shocking things in the sort of Jewish diaspora was the lack of, there's always been a criticism of the Israeli government and the Hebrew word hasbara, the lack of explaining the PR angle of Israel, that Israel's always struggled with that. But that almost for a while during this war, it felt like not just struggling with it, they're just ignoring it altogether, ignoring the idea of having to explain themselves. Is there truth to that?
No, I think that the magnitude of this hit us in so many ways. I mean, you saw even the sort of government agencies struggling to deal with this amount of, people murdered, of people displaced, of education systems that you need to create from scratch because so many people have been displaced. So a part of that was also that the hasbara, or this sort of explaining Israel to the rest of the world. I mean, when you have on the other side, these very complex and multi-layered, propaganda, we kind of didn't know what was growing under our noses, not only in the monstrous tunnels and ammunition by Hamas, but also this propaganda machine that it took a while for Israel to try. And I don't think it was, we can't explain ourselves, so we're not going to. It's just the sort of so much had to be done, and we weren't prepared. We weren't prepared for this as well.
Bianna, I want to get into the book here on anti-Semitism, but curious, we're speaking here just 2 weeks after the ceasefire went into effect. Obviously it's very precarious, literally as we record this. There's, a lot of back and forth. The vice president was just here. There are a lot of questions about the next phase of implementation. But, given what we know today, and given what we've seen unfold when it comes to anti-Semitism and the rise of it, what's your feeling right now, and maybe I'm asking you to speculate too much, about how much changes now that the active war, let's say, the ceasefire is actually able to be in effect for a while? Do you think a lot changed permanently, long term? Having the seat as a journalist, as a Jew, as a mother, as an American, on anti-Semitism and where we go from here?
I think given that this was such a lengthy war, Israel's longest, and for the past 2 years, we've seen wall-to-wall coverage and images of Gaza and images from this war. I mean, even if you take a step back, I've always viewed this region, this conflict, as particularly sort of outsized coverage relative to many other conflicts around the world. I mean, you mentioned some of these far-right ministers, and I ask you, what other country, the size of New Jersey, are their government ministers household names? I mean, can you name finance ministers of Germany, France, any other U.S. ally the way you can Israeli politicians? So
it's a remarkable thing. I like to remind folks that, I think there have been stats put out that, I don't know if it's per capita journalists or number of journalists, but outside of New York and D.C. and maybe London, Israel was probably the next most populous center for journalists globally.
Yes. And, we should note that many journalists around the world, and I would say Israeli journalists too, have been advocating for journalists to be allowed to go inside Gaza. And now that there is a ceasefire, we'll see if that changes. But I think we've just seen sort of a metastasized version of what happens throughout history, the recent history, anytime there had been a conflict in the region. Nothing has been this extreme or this long. But I think you could probably see a spike in anti-Semitic attacks around the world whenever there were wars, skirmishes in the Middle East that have been covered by the media, to a great extent. And just imagine you magnify that and expand it to 2 years worth of coverage every single day. And I think the best case scenario, just realistically, is that it sort of tones down a bit now, and hopefully the ceasefire first and foremost stays in place so lives can be rebuilt, so the hostages can get the help that they need. The remains of the other hostages can finally come back to Israel as well. Civilians in Gaza can have time to rebuild, and hopefully Hamas will be dismantled, or at least, at the very least, not in charge. But I don't know how we can ever forget what we've experienced over the past 2 years. It's been eye-opening. And I've constantly said, I'm a changed person. I'm a changed Jew. I'm a bit more apprehensive now and guarded, obviously wearing my Jewish heritage with pride. Yonit, actually, I don't know, you can see this necklace, but Yonit gave me a bet necklace when we were in Israel in March during the last ceasefire for my son's bar mitzvah. And I wear it every single day on air. It just is a bit more special when you hear children embrace their Judaism, because it's almost as if they do it in spite of some of the concerns that we have about their safety. So it's, Yonit in a previous interview had said it's sort of like a cancerous genie that can get put back in the bottle at times, but you can't ever get rid of it. And our goal here, even with this book, is to have, and Don't Feed the Lion, is to have at least one resource for adults and children in terms of how to deal with it.
Yeah, I want to talk about Don't Feed the Lion here. You guys write that this book was born out of fear and friendship, heartbreak and hope in the weeks following October 7th. Tell me about how the conversation started, the realization happened that this book needed to exist.
It's one of these stories where and going back to what we had said, it's not as if anti-Semitism was born on October 7th, 2023. It's been a cancerous, blight on society for millennia. And over the past few years, there had been moments, you'll recall, Mo, when certain celebrities would just post vile anti-Semitic tropes on social media, and it seemed they were able, maybe a slap on the wrist. Others were quick to apologize for them. So
right, that's just Kanye being off his meds,
right? Or Kyrie Irving. Again,
right.
My son was a huge sports fan, and that was really hurtful for him. And he literally came and asked me, can I not go to basketball games anymore? Or are we not wanted because we're Jewish? I don't understand. And when I didn't have the answers and went to their school and, talked to educators there about what resources they were providing on anti-Semitism, the response was basically, we have none. When kids this age want to ask, we wait until they ask about it, and then we discuss it. And I'm thinking, how many 11 or 12-year-old kids raise their hand in class and ask about anti-Semitism? So that was sort of planted in the back of my head, and it really did take October 7th for me to realize I think this is something we need to address now. I reached out to Yonit, and we did a bit of our own research and came to find that there were no books like this for this age group, such an impressionable age group. They still talk to their parents. They're very curious. They ask lots of questions. They're exposed to everything in the world, no matter how much we tried to guard them. And kindergartners have books on Hanukkah, and high school kids start to learn about the Holocaust. And yet this very important age group, just a generation before they go off to college, had no real resources.
It's a very tidy story. And I just remember us talking late every night because, we're both TV anchors. So I think we had to hold it together very much on air. And we were like each other's therapy, because she was the person I would talk to and say what I really feel, and vice versa. And at some point we were like, it is born out of this distress that says we have to do something. And it kind of, it spilled into that idea. It was Bianna's idea to actually, because of those stories that she's telling now, she's like, let's try and write this. And it's a crazy idea. I mean, if I'd known, in hindsight, it was just pretty crazy to say, okay, yeah, we can do this. Right, for this age group. And so that's
also interesting that you're two journalists who deal with facts and you're writing fiction.
Yeah.
I mean, while based on reality, what was that process like?
Well, again, it was very important, I thought, to have an Israeli co-author, not only because she's my best friend and we're so much alike, but because we just anticipated that there would be this not only spike in anti-Semitism, but also this question of, is it all Israel's fault, or should Israel even exist? And this delegitimization or the separation between, yes, Jews are not a monolith, and maybe there's a small portion of Jews that don't support Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. But as you know, Mo, and as we all know, the majority of Jews do support Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. So
right, and for those who are unfamiliar, it's core to the faith. That ultimately, it's like most of if you can't go to a Jewish service at synagogue on any holiday or the Sabbath or whatever, and not be talking about Zion, right? The land of Zion. And that's where our story begins.
Yeah, there are two flags at every synagogue, right? You have the American flag and you have the Israeli flag. And Yonit spent her formative years, as she has, as we noted, the brilliant journalist as she is, perfect English as well. So she knows America quite well. And she actually lived in Chicago for a little bit, where the book takes place. And it's fictional, but it's, again, based on a lot of real life events that happened, in my family, and I would imagine, many other Jewish families in the country.
Right. I was going to ask about that. The old adage is write what you know, right? And to what extent did you model the book based on experiences or characters in your life? And by the way, I should note, I was a Jewish boy growing up in Chicago as well. That's where my parents raised me, on the North Shore of Chicago. I had my bar mitzvah in Chicago. So reading this, I was like, this is the story of Moshe in the circa the mid-90s. Some differences ultimately with a Moroccan father. But ultimately, this addresses anti-Semitism through the lens of this Jewish boy, Theo Kaplan. Curious, who do you see the ideal audience here? One of the questions I got is is this just meant for, Jews to be reading in America? Is this meant for everybody? In your ideal world, who is reading this book?
I mean, in our ideal world, it's definitely not only for the Jewish community in the sense, and I think that's why the three main characters, there's a Theo, of course, 13-year-old, and his sister, younger sister, Annie, and his friend, Gabe, who is not Jewish. And it was important for us to have that kind of gaze of the ally, because that is a lot about what the book is about. I think there are many points where Gabe sees reality and knows what's right from wrong, perhaps better than others. So I think that kids everywhere who are dealing with that kind of hate that is kind of spewed at them, and that the grownups around them don't necessarily always know what the right thing to do is. And it takes some of the grownups some time. And I kind of would hope that also parents could read it, and maybe even with their kids, to sort of talk through this, because for us, what was important, however difficult the situation is, and the story is to kind of say, we're looking at it and we're trying to not look away. And there are questions that, when my son came to me and said, when this wave of anti-Semitism started, and he said, why are there people in the world who hate me without knowing me? And I was kind of floored by it, because I'm used to explaining to an Israeli kid what is happening in Israel, why there are terror attacks, why, but suddenly this question. And so that is what we tried to answer. So I guess the short version of the answer to your question is, I hope kids and their parents would want to read this.
I find that, there are only 15 million Jews on earth. A little over half of them live in Israel, and the rest are sort of scattered about, with the U.S. having the largest population. Yonit, how do you explain to Israelis what the mindset of Jews abroad and what Jews are experiencing? And, it's interesting. I think you also had Yossi Cohen on your podcast recently, the former head of Mossad. We had him on as well as he was rolling out his book. And one of the questions I asked him, and this sort of is parallel to the question I'm asking you, was, one of your roles as running Mossad is your mission is the national security and the protection of Israelis, but also Jews abroad. And I'm curious, at times, it's not 100% lockstep, right? Decisions that you have to make to protect Israel and Israelis sometimes may not, at least short term or potentially long term, help Jews abroad, right? And we've seen, Bianna, to your point, this attempt to okay, are you a good Jew or are you a bad Jew? Are you a Jew in America? Will you condemn Israel? Okay, then ultimately you're acceptable here, and trying to create the differentiation. Do Israelis understand what Jews abroad go through, given that they get to grow up in the only country with a Jewish majority in the world? And how do you explain that, to Israelis who are sort of confused by what they see happening with the Jewish community abroad?
So, we mentioned, I'm sorry to mention it again, but the podcast that I started 5 years ago, which was just dedicated to the conversation between Israel and diaspora with Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian, or the way that Jonathan says it, I'm the Guardian, you're Israel. So you understand it's an interesting conversation. But to my surprise was that a third of our listeners come from Israel. And they are not necessarily Americans in any way. They're Israelis who listen to this every week. It's in English. And they come up to me and they say, we love the podcast. And I'm always curious, because I say, you get me on the news in Hebrew. Why do you need to listen to this in English? And the answer is because we're curious about the conversation. And so first of all, I would say that the good news is that Israelis care about diaspora more than I think initially we would naturally be inclined to think. And I think now, with this terrible heartbreak of this wave of anti-Semitism, they really are trying to understand as best they can. I think that the beautiful thing about us, if I can be that, I love this country and its people that much, I would say that we have the room to kind of, as I said, we were very focused on what is happening to us, but I think we have the room to try and understand what is happening to the communities outside of Israel.
Bianna, now that you have this book out, you're going to be the resident expert for Jewish parents around the world. You and Yonit. I imagine you're going to be getting these questions, and you've already gotten these questions, Bianna. When it comes to advice you have for both Jewish families and non-Jewish families on how to discuss anti-Semitism with, you were talking about sort of 8 to 15-year-olds, right? This middle school, junior high audience. What advice do you have to sort of get started? We have a large audience, and the majority of them are not Jewish, but they, I would often get questions in the aftermath of October 7th, like how can we be an ally? How do I explain this? And curious, you saw clearly the lack of resources there, but what advice do you give, and what places should they be turning to?
Such a good question. There are, we talk about the darkness that came out of October 7th. It's important to highlight the bright spots too, and how many allies. They may not have been as loud as some of, the voices that we heard and saw, especially on social media. But there were a lot of allies, surprising allies around the world, old friends, neighbors. When we moved to the U.S. as refugees, we settled in Texas and, in a suburb outside of Houston where I was the only Jew, and, then of course, a Russian Jew on top of that. And for many of my friends and peers, it was the first time they actually met someone who was Jewish. And what we came to find out was, some of their thoughts and views and beliefs were challenged when they got to know people who they had only read about or heard tropes about. I went to church with my friends. They went to temple with me, and we got to know about each other's cultures that way. I think for present day, we try to guard and shield our kids. And what adults tend to do is tell kids not to listen to that gut feeling in their stomach. And we get to that in the book too. Kids are very observant. They're very emotional. And a lot of them have tons of empathy. And when they see that the adults around them, their parents, teachers, coaches, aren't expressing that as well, it becomes a very unsettling situation and environment for them. So I think, from what we've learned, and one of the reasons we wanted to write this book was, for whatever reason, this is a subject matter that people tiptoe about because they think, oh, now we're going to have to dive into Israel, Palestine, the conflict in the Middle East. That's really murky, uncomfortable, emotional. So we're just not going to do it. And the truth is, and this book is set in 2022, for that reason, we just didn't feel that we needed to. If we go back, even Mo, to the time we worked together at CBS, the worst attack on Jews in this country happened in 2018, the Tree of Life shooting. And that attacker and that shooter was sort of a right-wing nut who, opposed immigration policies and was targeting Hayas. And incidentally, that's the Jewish resettlement agency that helped my family move to the U.S.
Right, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid organization that now helps non-Jews also settle into the U.S. Yeah,
exactly. And so the most important thing I think families can do is have these conversations, because as Jews, we're unique perhaps to be on the receiving end of hate from all different sides for all different reasons. And yes, you can have conversations about the Middle East and Israel and the Palestinian conflict there, but it's much deeper than that. And I think even if it's uncomfortable, I advise all schools, all parents, all teachers to really tackle this issue head on, the way they have other forms of hate that have also, been very uncomfortable at times and painful. But unless children hear from the adults around them that this is a top priority and we can't allow it, then I think it's just going to fester and we'll see more and more generations spiral.
Yeah, you mentioned, being critical of the Israeli government, and one of the questions I think you get from I've gotten from a number of Americans is like, wait, how can it be anti-Semitic to criticize Israel? And I try to explain that distinction. I would love for you to sort of lay out, first, give folks perspective on how critical Israelis are of their own government, and sort of the distinguishing, as we've had the layers here between criticizing Israel, criticizing various policies, criticizing the war in Gaza, what have you, and anti-Semitism.
Look, there's a rule of thumb that I would say to be quite, simple about this. Criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitism. Criticizing only Israel does lead you to suspect that it might be. If you are only looking at one country in the world and, anything that country does is wrong in your eyes, then that is not only anti-Zionism. The one example that kind of jumps somehow to my head is the criticism that Israel received after the pager attacks in Lebanon. Why are you hurting civilians? And the interesting thing about it was that the criticism against Israel when it came to Gaza was, you are hurting too many innocents. We understand the justification for the war, but you have to somehow minimize this. The pager attack was specifically dedicated to only hurt, in many cases not even kill, just hurt the people who were part of a terror organization. So they would, have these pagers that would get coded messages. And Israel was essentially doing what the world was saying it should be doing, which is minimizing any sort of collateral damage is perhaps a problematic term, but any sort of hurting civilians. And so in that regard, I was saying, wait a minute, instead of actually saying to Israel, okay, this is a good thing, the same critique came. So when people only criticize Israel, that to me is a sort of red flag, signaling that something is wrong in the way that the world is construed or built at this point. I mean, Bianna mentioned it. No one is following anything else as closely as this. I am really far from saying that we are blameless in everything that happened in the war in Gaza. It is a very very long war that Israel wasn't prepared for. So it should be looked at for sure and reported about, of course, but the number of, biases that you see throughout this is just astounding. So I think that is something that I usually look at. Are the people who are criticizing Israel, are they criticizing anything else? And yes, just to add into that, Israelis are extremely, extremely critical of their own government, for sure. I mean, remember, Israel doesn't need the prime minister, the leader of this country, doesn't need a 50% plus one to be elected. He needs his own base because it is a coalition government. So you're always going to have actually more of a majority that is that will be criticizing the government and the prime minister. And this is, we should say, an unpopular government.
I mean, just think of it, Mo. I mean, look at who a lot of our guests are, given the coverage that we've had. Every hour on the hour, multiple times. We've covered this war, and a lot of our guests and experts are Israeli journalists, are members of hostage families, who've been very critical of their own government. So I think that's also something worth noting too. It's not just the outside world that feels that they can speak out against the Israeli government. Just like in America and in other democracies around the world, you have a press that feels, or a population that feels, that they can do the same.
It's interesting, speaking here, somebody was asking me I did a panel recently about the mayoral election, which obviously Israel and Judaism has taken center stage, given what's unfolding, the election that's unfolding here in New York City. And, they were asking me about, like the age-old question that Jews ask ourselves: is this good for the Jews? Is this bad for the Jews? And
we don't do that. Do we do that? Do we do anything else?
Fake news, Mo.
And it's interesting because it's like, I was like, well, like thinking epigenetically, like the reason the Jews who are alive today, we had the ancestors that were probably the most anxious about what was going on, and asking that question is probably one of the reasons that, we're here talking to one another today. We weren't the chill ones. Our ancestors weren't the chill ones who are like, it'll be fine. We're the ones who are like, it's time to pack up and leave. Curious as, you've written this book, and I know you mentioned this was therapeutic for both of you. How do you feel after writing this book, after going through this experience? I mean, aside from the fact that you're a journalist who cover this stuff, how are you feeling today? Would you call yourselves optimists, especially when it comes to that question? Where are we as a people? How are we feeling as a people? How are you feeling as individuals today?
I'm a worried optimist.
Worried optimist.
I'm a worried optimist.
I think that's perfectly an accurate thing to say. I'm living, we live in the Middle East and what feels like a volcano. So what do you have besides optimism and being very, very alert at the same time? So that's where we are, I think.
I heard someone use the expression that, there's the phrase cautiously optimistic, but in the Middle East, the operative phrase is cautiously pessimistic. Before I let you go, Yonit, just since you're kind of eyes and ears on the ground in Israel right now, curious, for our listeners, what they should be looking at in the coming months here, especially with, elections happening, within a year. Give us sort of the major headlines and trends that you're watching right now as this ceasefire continues and as the election takes place in the coming months.
First of all, I think officially elections are slated for the end of 2026. I think you're right about saying it's going to be earlier than that. To me, I'm fascinated by Benjamin Netanyahu's character in the way that I don't think there is he's a maverick politician. He has the smartest mind of a politician. And I would say that the things to watch, he is in an election year and he wants to continue to be prime minister. And I think the two things I would look at quite clearly are I would say his calculation would be he can win if there's peace and he can win if there's war. What I mean by that is to see, do we see any signals of normalization with Saudi Arabia or beyond? That is one thing to watch. The other thing to watch is actually the opposite. I mean, rising tensions when it comes to Iran, for instance, perhaps a return to Gaza in some form or another. So those are the two things that I would look at this point. Of course, internally in Israel, we can't forget the kind of main issue that is sort of percolating everything, of course, is the argument about ultra-Orthodox and their attempt to write a new law that would basically exempt them from military service. That is after a very, very painful war with many soldiers that have fallen. So this is the sort of argument that is tearing apart Israeli society, and that is all to watch. I'm trying to think of something fun to watch. So perhaps Israeli television would be something to recommend. I just watch the news. That's not fun. So
well, the other thing to watch is Donald Trump, because obviously Netanyahu really is going to need the continued support from Donald Trump. Whenever that election is going to be, Trump will still be president here. And he sort of alluded to that when he spoke before the Knesset, talking about his unconditional support for Israel, asking for a pardon for Prime Minister Netanyahu.
That was pretty remarkable.
Yeah, but he buttoned up the unconditional support for Israel with, sort of an ominous warning, unless you elect someone crazy or something like that. So,
well, and it comes as Barak Ravid had that report today. As we're recording this, Trump will fuck up Benjamin Netanyahu if he jeopardizes the ceasefire deal, if he keeps going, and he Fs up the Gaza deal. If he Fs up the deal, Trump will F him.
I hope you're going to beep this because my mother's listening. So I'm going to have to tell her not to listen to this conversation.
That word has a different meaning, no? In some languages. Friend, right?
It's a fascinating thing. Actually, one additional question you need. You've watched several American presidents and their interactions with the Middle East and with Israel. What does Trump understand about the region, or what is it about his character, the way that he, pursues policy and negotiations that has made him more successful, at least thus far, in the Middle East than some of his predecessors?
I've not only watched, I've interviewed five American presidents. Trump has eluded me so far. So if he's listening, I'm sure that he is listening to this podcast. I think it would be a good idea. And I think the difference was that all of them, it's not a coincidence that they spoke to me, because they were trying in many cases to speak to the Israeli public directly instead of over the heads of the Israeli prime minister, who was, almost perennially Benjamin Netanyahu. And so I think what is different is that he has in his mind, I was talking to a very seasoned diplomat recently, and he said to me, Trump is not, he doesn't have a clear ideology. He's a pragmatist. He knows what he wants, and he's going to get it, and he's going to tell Netanyahu, you give me this and that's it. I don't think any other president had that leverage over the Israeli prime minister. Most of them would try and do that. And then Netanyahu would say to his, play what he's very good at, this sort of leveraging of his coalition and the American administration. Here, he kind of doesn't have a choice. And I think that having a president that is very good with deals means that he will give everyone what they need and want, whether it's the Qataris or Turkey or Israel or Hamas, in a way that others would probably not dare at this time to risk it. And he did dare and risk it.
And Bianna, final question for you as a longtime journalist. I have some observations about, or some surprises in terms of how the media has covered this war and covered anti-Semitism. I'm curious from your perspective, what has anything particularly surprised you, having spent a long time working at several networks in the U.S. and several organizations, about the way coverage has gone the past couple of years? Yeah, I mean, listen, I'm fortunate to work at a network with a lot of real estate and to have my own show where I can, tell stories, I feel in the most objective way as possible. And I've been able to get to know and cover, especially, the hostages and their plight and their families, and spend, I think, 3 or 4 trips since October 7th, in Israel on the ground there. I do think, going back to what I was saying earlier, it was a bit surprising and perhaps at times lonely when there were certain moments, events, statements that, as a Jew, and I know I wasn't alone, I felt very hurt by or worried about or viewed as blatant anti-Semitism. The college protests, the heads of the universities and their testimony. And it did feel like there wasn't that same understanding and compassion from the other side, from journalists who,
I imagine would have known better or had more experience when it came to dealing with anti-Semitism, because we've covered a lot of other forms of hate of minorities as well. And so there were moments where it was a bit lonely. Another reason to turn to Yonit. So I think it was a wake up opportunity as well, because it's not just our kids that need to be educated, I think, about what anti-Semitism feels like and what it is, but I think, just like we continue to be educated as journalists by events in the world, I really hope this was an opportunity for a lot of our peers and our viewers to understand that anti-Semitism is alive and kicking. It's dangerous. It's painful. And, in 2025, these are not conversations that any civilized, progressive society should be having and dealing with.
All right. Thank you guys for joining. To be continued, but congrats on the book.
Thank you.
Important. And it sounded, I think in one of your videos, you said, Bianna, our first book. So it sounds like you guys are working on a series.
You're sharp. You're very sharp.
Thanks for following us, Mo.
We know what the next project is.
I live way too much of my life on social media, and that caught my ear. I go, our first book.
Well, let's see how it goes. But yes, we do have plans.
I think there's an opportunity for textbooks too. I do media literacy sessions with high schoolers and junior high students, helping them navigate AI and finding truth in media and how to question sources, etc. But I think this is another, really valuable educational tool that I don't know how much is out there right now.
It's a good idea. It's very, very smart of you to be tackling this too.
Especially as the state of media goes the way it does, Bianna. We have to find what part 2 is going to be of our careers.
I mean, I'm open to suggestions, Mo. So any opportunity I get to work with you and Yonit, it's a dream come true.
All right. Well, thank you guys.
Thanks so much.
Mo.